Good morning and welcome. This is the budget work session for a special session for the Marion City Council on January 25th, 2019. And looks like we have everyone here ready to get started. Okay, who's going to lead us through this?
I get to do that.
Okay.
So some of this will look familiar from last year, but we have also made some changes to the way that we have the budget format and how we'll run through the presentation. So just the general normal way that we expect today to operate. I'll be doing the main budget presentations, but as always, don't be afraid to ask any questions that occur to you as they come up. And just for the administrative side of things, there's restrooms available out in the foyer, and then we have one over here right through the door to my left of the council dais. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes just to kind of go through the basics of how the budget is set up. The general fund is the city's largest single fund and pays for the bulk of all of the services that relate to public safety, relate to building inspection, administration, anything that doesn't have a dedicated source of revenue like the proprietary funds. So you'd have administration and internal services, the combined community development, which is planning and building inspection, engineering, library, parks and rec, public safety. Single largest source of revenue, of course, for that is property taxes, followed by fee for services and transfers in from other funds. The biggest transfers in come from what's termed the trust and agency fund. In the budget documents, it's called a special revenue fund. That's the one where the city has the ability to levy separately for the cost of employee benefits. And then the proprietary funds do support the general fund in a couple of different ways. One is we have some direct allocations of costs. So, for example, a portion of my salary is allocated out to the proprietary funds. And then there's also a flat transfer that comes in from the proprietary funds for operating support. That's intended to pay for things like the cost of having City Hall and those operating expenses for the departments that support the proprietary funds where they don't have their own dedicated staff to do that. So, for example, water and sewer can't really run without having finance staff to manage the money. And that's the basis behind that. So after the general fund, then you have the enterprise and proprietary funds. Those two terms are generally interchangeable. In the eyes of the state, those are business-type accounts that are supposed to be funded by fees for service. The phrase that you'll hear me use often when I say fiduciary responsibility, those funds are supposed to be self-sufficient. They're supposed to pay their own way and function as independent business units, really, in all aspects of how they operate. That's part of why we do staff allocations for a lot of those support services between city and city management, finance, engineering provides support and does work for sanitary sewer, so a portion of their costs would come from sanitary sewer, etc. We have added to this list over the years with the stormwater utility. Marion had one. I think the stormwater utility was first added in 94 or 96, but it was a base monthly fee, just a flat fee, and we transitioned it over to a utility basis where it's based on the contribution to the system off of an ERU system several years ago, and then we added the urban forest utility. The water department is unique in that it's considered a component unit of the city of Marion. So it has a board that's appointed by the city council, but they have their own independent budget, independent manager, and do function as a true business enterprise. The other phrase that you'll hear is that trust and agency fund phrase, which, as I said, we account for as special revenue. Anything that has restrictions on the use of the money would come in through here. So employee benefits, when you levy for employee benefits, they can be spent, that money can be spent on things like health insurance, costs of retirement for IPERS, municipal police and fire, etc. But it can only be used for those purposes. You couldn't use it, for example, to pay for wages or to buy a piece of equipment or something like that. If we have a grant come in, we will funnel those through these accounts. The police department, by virtue of participating in various task forces, can receive forfeiture funds that would come through here. And there are times that Marion receives donations, whether it's for something like a parks project or whether somebody wants to, donate a bench to memorialize someone or in one of the parks, those would be funneled through here. But the single largest expense through there on an annual basis is that cost of employee benefits. And then we have a few funds out there that I would classify as being quasi-enterprise. And the reason I say that is because they function in many ways like an enterprise fund does, but they're not run quite the same way. So like road use I would throw into this category because we run it as an enterprise fund where it's got a restricted source of revenue and restricted uses. However, it's not one where the council has the discretion to say we need to raise our road use rates. That formula is created by the state and is essentially based off of population. So when we do special censuses in between the normal decade census, this is one of the funds that will significantly benefit. I think right now the estimate is it's about $120 per person that Marion would receive funding from the state allocation. The state breaks it up, collects it, breaks it up. The DOT gets the bulk of the money, and then cities and counties get 20 and 22% of the road use funds statewide collectively. This isn't one that has kind of flatlined as far as the state is concerned. Road miles traveled haven't changed a whole lot since 2007 after decades and decades and decades of those going up. The major bump that it was received was after the state went through and added about $200 million to the fund by increasing things like vehicle licensing fees. So it's one that we keep a close eye on because frankly, the state's formula that the DOT uses for this still hasn't quite caught up to the stabilization of revenues coming into that fund. They're using a lot of years of history that were based off of it going up and up and up, so that we find that a lot of times their projections tend to be a little optimistic. So we usually scale back their number, and my rule of thumb is to use about 97.5% of what they're estimating, just so we don't start counting on more money that's going to be coming in than we would receive. And then local option sales tax. Local option sales tax, the use of that is governed by the ballot language that the voters approved. And in our case, 70% of it goes towards roads and infrastructure, and then 30% can be spent on any general or central corporate purpose. We have with one exception, put that towards infrastructure projects or contributions towards capital projects. We'll get into that exception when we start talking about some of the budgets in the general fund. So that way you'll understand kind of the vernacular and the terms that I'll be using throughout the day. So what we're going to be going through first is to talk about the revenue side of the equation. And we've got it split into several different parts. We're going to be talking about general fund, then the proprietary funds, and then the capital projects funds. And I want to talk about what kind of constraints or threats that we have related to those, what our expectations are, and then what we're looking for towards future revenue in these. So with the general fund, your major sources, of course, are property taxes, those fees for services, the enterprise and proprietary fund support that we receive, both via indirect costing and direct allocation of staff, and then local option sales tax. In the local option sales tax use, we actually do fund 2 positions in engineering using local option sales tax. That's the exception that I was talking about. Several years ago, we took a proposal back to the local option sales tax committee to have them consider about whether or not we would be better off to actually fund staff positions for engineering versus contracting for engineering on all of our projects. Typically, when you contract out for engineering, say on a road project, you're going to pay anywhere between 10 and 15% of the cost of that project for your contract engineering services. So on a $1 million road project, you're going to spend anywhere between $100,000 and $150,000 on top of your construction cost for contracting. And that was going to be on every single project. And so when we started to look at it, we figured that if we had a staff engineer, that staff engineer could do that same work but do maybe 4 projects for us and really significantly cut our costs for engineering, let us get more actual physical infrastructure on the ground using the local option sales tax dollars. And the committee did endorse that use, and so we added that in as part of our operating budget. That does mean, however, that those two positions are funded by Lost, and if Lost were to end, that those positions do go away. The reason I wanted to focus on that one a little bit, we can talk about it a little bit more later, is that, from engineering's perspective, the closer we get towards 2024 with the expiration of that, if there's not action to extend local option sales tax, those folks are going to start looking for jobs because they're going to start getting nervous about continued employment and where they can, and what is going to happen with those positions. It's kind of a natural match that if we don't have local option sales tax, you've got $4 million a year worth of projects that go away, so the demand isn't going to be there. At the same time, we want to make sure that it's not causing excessive turnover in those positions or making it difficult to keep somebody on staff to do that work. In conversations with Cedar Rapids, it sounds like 2022 is when they're looking to potentially put the local option sales tax back out for a vote. I don't know if they're going to be looking for a 10-year extension, if they're going to be looking for a 20-year or a 5-year. None of that was part of the conversation, just wanting to get an idea for when it might come about. That would be a full 2 years before the local option sales tax would expire, so I'm hoping that that would be more than enough lead time for anybody in the engineering department to feel comfortable that they'll know what's going to happen with that before they start turning those positions into a revolving door. So on the property tax side, this is what the council saw with the first draft of the budget. As you can see here, the levy rate for the current fiscal year is $14.22 per thousand, and next year it's $14.36 per thousand as proposed. Major drivers for that are trust and agency, cost of employee benefits, and then the debt service levy is going up a little bit. We did gain back some room in that levy with pulling the emergency levy back. If you remember from last year's budget discussions, we talked about using the emergency levy to a certain extent just as a backstop in case the state decided to act on backfill. They did not do that, and so everything that we're hearing this year, including the governor's first budget proposal, has that fully funded, and so we're not including that as proposed in the draft budget. One thing I did want to talk about here is that as valuation in Marion changes, we do tend to gain some room in some of our variable levies because of the downward pressure that that puts on our fixed levies. And so, for example, if we have ones where we have a fixed contribution amount, you can look, for example, the tort liability levy is proposed to go down year over year and has gone down year over year. That's because if we have costs in that, we levy for a property casualty insurance. That's what pays for those types of expenses. As long as the amount that we're being charged for that doesn't raise faster than the property tax valuation does, that levy can continue to go down, which means that we have opportunities to keep the rate steady but allocate money towards other areas. The debt service levy in particular tends to vary a bit because it's based on the actual amount of debt that the city incurs and what our actual debt payments are in that given fiscal year. That was one that we really focused on a lot when we were talking with the council about approving the CIP and the impact that those projects would have on there. The debt service levy as proposed does include an interest payment for the 2019 borrowing that will be coming here in front of the council. So we've got that piece already in there. We are, based on these numbers, already ahead of where we projected to be in the CIP and the impact that that was going to have on the debt service levy overall. So some of these levies are fixed, and the amount that we'll collect will go up based on natural valuation increases. The regular levy, that levy has been fixed at $8.10 for decades. It's been that since I first started in this business 25 years ago, and there seems to be absolutely zero appetite at the state to ever change that. That's the only levy that we have that the council can really spend on any general or essential corporate purpose. So it's our single biggest source of revenue, followed by trust and agency. Both of those go to support the cost of employees and benefits in the general fund. The ag land levy is limited by the state. That's just what that levy is. And it varies from year to year, really, honestly, based on how much farmland we have in the city limits and what the rollback on that farmland is. So if we do a big annexation and we add a couple hundred acres of farmland, we'll see a little bit of a bump in that. But then as that farmland develops and converts over to other uses, you'll see those numbers go down. Transit levy, we fund a couple of different things out of that. One is the cost of our contract with Cedar Rapids for providing our fixed route bus service. That's the circulator route that goes through Marion. And then we also levy for our contribution to neighborhood transportation services through Horizon. So those are the two pieces that we've historically used that for. Civic Center goes towards parks operations as a fixed levy. It's the only way that the collections on that go up is when it's tied to valuation. Same thing with the library levy. That was voted in, I think, in 1989 as a permanent levy to go towards operating support for the Marion Library. So overall, we're projecting to see an increase in collections of about $1.5 million between the current fiscal year and next fiscal year, with about 710,000 of that going towards the regular, and then the rest of it going towards debt service and trust and agency as the largest beneficiaries. Yeah.
Lon, can you go into a little more detail on the trust and agency line? I mean, that's the second biggest one. It's also the one that's gone up the most. And I know I didn't even look at this last year, but if I look at it in pure dollars and in pure rate, that's really the driver, the biggest driver for causing the overall levy to go up. How is that calculated?
That's calculated based off of our actual cost of benefits for employees, primarily in the general fund. So one of the biggest things that will push that is the cost of medical insurance. There's two pieces to that. As the cost of a premium goes up, it will push that number up. But as you add employees, then that number would go up as well, because the salary comes out of one side, but if you create a new position, then the benefits come out of that piece as well. When you have positions, and one of the things that's going to impact that is when you add public safety positions. The main difference being is that when you look at the cost of benefits on a public safety position, they are higher than they are if they are for, say, an IPERS covered position. For better or worse, Marion is in the 411 retirement system, Municipal Police and Fire Retirement System of Iowa, which has a higher contribution rate towards retirement than IPERS covered employees do. Now, they don't contribute towards FICA like IPERS covered employees do, so there is a little bit of an equalization, but if you were to put the two side by side and look at the cost of benefits, you'd see that the cost of benefits for, say, the police chief are higher than, as a percentage, are higher than mine. So as you add public safety positions, that will push that up faster than the rate of inflation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's an actual, so if we were to find a way to better control that cost, if there's a way to do that, then this number gets controlled and could be decreased.
Right.
Theoretically.
Mm-hmm. That's why we focus, the single biggest driver in that one and the single biggest premium as an individual is the cost of medical insurance. That's why we focus so intensively on medical insurance. That's why I talked about the impact that our well-being program has had on our premium increases. You know, we're looking at about a 3.7% increase in health insurance costs this year compared to Wellmark's book of business, which I think they said was averaging about 8%. So we've done really well. Historically, if you were to look over the last I think 8 years. I don't think we've had one double-digit increase. If I'm remembering it correctly, our biggest increase that we had was around between 7 and 8%. So we've really been outperforming a lot of the employers that are underneath Wellmark, and a lot of that's been because we've really focused on that one as a big driver. We have zero control over what happens with the contributions to the retirement system. IPERS tends to be fairly steady. They're limited statutorily to only increasing or decreasing up to 0.5% a year. This last year, they averaged just a little over 7% on their returns, so they didn't propose any increase. The municipal police and fire retirement side has a different standard for what they have to be actuarially sound, and so there is a lot of variability in that one from year to year. This year they did well, just like IPERS did, so they actually reduced their rate by about 1.6%. But we have had years where they've jumped up as much as 6% in a year. And that's our two largest departments. Between police and fire, that's half of the general fund. And so when there's a big increase in that levy, it can be $400,000 to $600,000 a year that one will swing. More questions on that? Okay.
I guess I do. Lon, I'm sorry for the delay there. I'm just, as we're moving forward, and knowing that those departments will require more funding going forward, what kind of tools are we implementing for that? As we take a look at a 5-year projection, and it is a major component to that, but yet we know that we're going to need to be adding physical bodies in those positions with the expansion of the city. So can you just give us, I guess, or just a 30,000-foot view as to we're not going to be able to reduce it. We're going to have to actually be finding ways to actually fund it. So can you just kind of elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, there's several things that we're looking at with that. So, for example, one of the things that we're looking at this year, and we've really been looking at every year, is on medical insurance, for example, we are self-insured. So we have a fund that we pay up to the first $30,000 worth of expenses, and then we have a stop-loss policy that at $30,000 that starts to pick up any costs over that. So with any group our size, you're going to have a certain number of large claims. You've got 200 employees and 500 lives that are covered between families and kids. You're going to have people that need chemotherapy. You're going to have people that break a leg and need surgery. Those are your large claims. So one of the ways that we can do that is to take a look at how much risk are we willing to accept and what is the appropriate number for that stop-loss policy to be set at. So when you look at those large claims and you look at how many are underneath that, if we look at that and say, you know what, we're paying X number of dollars a year for a $30,000 stop-loss policy. If we move to a $40,000 stop-loss policy, that will shrink, but we're taking more risk down here. So what's the difference? If we assume more risk, are we going to still spend less than we would by the premium savings up here? So we evaluate that every year. We've been right on the cusp of whether or not we need to or we can make that change and actually save money by doing that. We've looked at $40,000, we've looked at $50,000 to really see where that return on the investment would be for us. My rule of thumb on it has been that if I can say that we're going to save 6 figures by doing that we would pull the trigger on it. Anything less than 6 figures I thought was a little bit too much rolling the dice on whether or not there was enough benefit there to outweigh the risk of making that change. So that's one. Another one is to consider whether or not we should look at changing the plan design a little bit to maybe start self-funding the deductibles. Our deductibles for employees and for individuals are driven by the union contracts, and so that has to be negotiated. But there would be some possibilities there that we could do some things to, for example, if our out-of-pocket maximum right now is $3,000, what does it look like if we move our plan with Wellmark to $6,000, but then we self-fund the difference so it's transparent to the employee? That requires more work on the administrative side. You have to set that up, but that would be a possibility that we could take a look at do we save enough on premiums by doing that to counterbalance the cost of self-funding the additional difference on the deductibles? You can do the same things. I mean, you don't see it a lot in Iowa on the public sector side, but you are seeing more on the private sector side with people going to health savings accounts and things like that to help supplement higher deductible plans. So we're continuing to evaluate those going forward. We do have not only our agreement with Wellmark, but then we have an agreement with Gallagher Benefit Services. They take a look at and analyze our medical funds separately from Wellmark so that we have another set of eyes on them.
Thank you. I always appreciate that. And for the benefit of the audience, I am a major writer of Blue Cross and Blue Shield from the health insurance sector, from the individual market, and taking a look at our current insurance contract that we have with the city, it is extremely a rich plan. The average individual health care plan out there is a $3,000 or $5,000 deductible with a $5,000 and $8,000 maximum out of pocket. An average 55-year-old male will pay anywhere between $600 and $800. As an individual, a female will be anywhere between $650 and $900. So from the individual sector, health insurance is extremely expensive. And because of the ACA rules and things that go into that make up that model, I've been doing this for 23 years, not as long as Draper, but I've never seen health insurance premiums at an all-time high that they ever have. I see families that are paying $1,500 and $1,700 a month for their private health care plans. So just to reiterate again, too, the city's contract is extremely rich in benefits and low in premiums. So kudos to the staff for trying to find those ways of saving money, and ultimately that drips back down to the employees as well. So it's a great job. Thank you, Lon.
Mm-hmm. So to move from the proposed property tax rate in the first draft over to what we use to help shape that, in addition to those fixed costs that we know that we're going to have to pay for, we also have some council policies that we need to follow. The primary one being that in the general fund we have a reserve requirement of 35%. Now, that 35% is based off of actual expenditures. We do not count the transfers in or any transfers out towards that 35%. The reason we do that is because it's kind of turns into a never-ending cycle if you do that. If you count a transfer in of $1 million and you have to have 35% of it in reserve, you either come up with that 35% out of property taxes or you try to transfer in $1.35 million. But when you transfer in $1.35 million, now you have to have 35% of $1.35 million. So it becomes this never-ending cycle to try to accommodate that. So with that requirement, we focus on the expenditure side, what we're actually spending on providing services, not transfers. So the first draft would bring that in at 39% at the end of the fiscal year, and all of these are based off of a 5.5% growth in valuation. If you look at our raw valuation numbers, you'll see that we received several different ones from the county. There's what they would call your general fund valuation and then your debt service valuation. The main difference there between those two numbers is how much of the total municipal valuation is being captured for use in tax increment financing. When we capture revenue for tax increment financing, there is an impact to the general fund for doing that, because that money gets used for a specific purpose and doesn't get allocated out towards the general fund. The debt service levy number is exempt from tax increment financing. So the total valuation number, if you want to see what happened to Marion's total value year over year, you look at the debt service figure, because that's the actual representation of the community's total value. When we capture an increment in tax increment financing, say we decide that we're going to do a rebate over to a business for doing that. If we give them $100,000 a year, the city is giving up $14,000 $14,220 out of the general fund for the period of that rebate while we do it. But it allows us to tap into the other components of the levy that we don't normally have access to. So rather than the city paying 100% of the cost of economic development that benefits all the taxing entities, it means that the other taxing entities actually are making a contribution towards that project that they're ultimately going to benefit from as well. And I would say that, in Marion, if I can say this without sounding a little bit too braggy, I think we're one of the leaders in the way that we do economic development to ensure that we're actually sizing our incentive packages to what the business's actual needs are in order to make them move forward. I call that the but-for test, that but for Marion providing the help, the project would not be able to proceed. It's much more common to just see communities say, if you do this kind of a project, you're going to get X. You do a commercial project, you're going to get 5 years, 75%, no questions asked. That's not been our philosophy here. I think when you start doing that, frankly, that's what starts raising red flags at the state level about the uses of tax increment financing, because how do you verify for sure that the business actually needed it or not? We do a much more robust analysis than that. So what kind of threats are there out there to the general fund? First and foremost, the biggest one is that levy limitation. $8.10 has been fixed in there for at least 25 years. I can't think of another cost factor that has been fixed for 25 years where they just expect you to be able to continue to provide the same level of services with a fixed amount that can be paid towards that year after year after year. For all that we can do to try to become more efficient, for all that we can use technology to forestall the need to add staff, for everything that we can do to do our jobs more efficiently, there are things that we don't have control over. We don't have control over the cost of what happens with property and casualty insurance. We don't have control over what it costs to build a street. If I have a frustration with the state, it's just that kind of a stubborn position on their part that somehow or another you can continue to do that year after year after year after year after year without being able to adjust that. Again, we are also very dependent on property taxes. That growth in valuation year over year really is needed in many cases just to maintain the status quo. One of the exercises that I asked Zach to shoehorn into working on the budget was to take a look and say, for where we're at right now with our cost of staff and benefits in the general fund, what do we need to have for valuation growth year over year just to fund existing commitments without adding staff from year to year? And it's anywhere between 3.4 and 3.7% is needed in base valuation growth year over year just to fund existing commitments. So you have to have more than 3.4% to even contemplate starting to add staff or starting to add other services into the general fund. And that's something that, while Marion has a realistic shot to be able to hit 3% year over year, as long as the community continues to grow, think about all the communities that move backwards that are faced with that same problem. I know I've iterated to the council many times that I would much rather have to deal with the problems related to growth than the problems related to shrinkage. Marion does benefit from that, and if you look at our last several years, we have been averaging that number or greater. It's just when I look forward and think about, can I really forecast that that's going to continue every year for the next 20 years? No. We can't. You can look over the last 10 years, and while we've been averaging 3% or better, there have been years where we've had 1.1% or 2.2% growth. So we have to make sure that we're building a budget that's sustainable, that we're not overcommitting ourselves to be able to handle those kind of fluctuations from year to year.
Lon, is there any talk by the legislature to do anything with property taxes this year?
They have mentioned property taxes. It's just I get nervous when they mention property taxes because usually that means they're going to try to limit them further. I don't know what they have in mind. Honestly, my preference would be take that $8.10 and unbundle it, and give councils and give localities the ability to make more deliberate decisions. So that if you decide you want to do, for example, public safety, a public safety levy, a general administration levy, unbundle that 810 and provide more flexibility at the local level.
What do you mean that's a bundled number? I've never heard that description before.
The 810 goes into the general fund, but it's not allocated towards any one specific purpose. If you
Right.
think about, let me put it in the context of what we've talked about for the utilities funds. You know, right now the utilities are a blended rate. So when we do a rate increase, that funds capital projects and it also funds operating expenses. If you unbundle it, you'd have a rate for capital projects and a rate for operating expenses. You could do the same thing with property taxes, where you give localities the ability to say, we want to levy this amount to fund public safety services. We want to levy this amount for cultural and recreational services, and separate those out. I think that would be a lot more transparent, honestly, for the public to be able to present it that way.
Okay.
Last year we spent a lot of time talking about the backfill, so I'm not going to exclusively focus on that this year as much, because it just doesn't seem like it's under as much threat. Where I get nervous is just historically the state of Iowa makes promises, the legislature turns over, and they suddenly forget that prior legislatures made promises. It's happened with municipal police and fire, it's happened with backfill numbers on homestead credits, veterans exemptions, all sorts of things over the years. Cities used to receive a bank franchise tax, and then the state took that over, and then they took over electrical licensing and inspection. Most of the time when they start talking about that, it means that they are going to just keep the money. And that's at $152 million, it's a nice big round number in the budget. And so while I think it's okay for this year, I do think as we build the budget forward, I want to make sure that we still have capacity that we can make up for that loss at some point in the future. As long as we're not touching the emergency levy, we've got some ability to be able to do that.
Remind us of the number.
This year it was about 435,000. Yeah. It's one that actually is difficult to project, because since the state fixed their contribution at $152 million, the pie gets sliced up differently every year based on factors like population growth, what your percentage of the overall state property tax levy is. So we're projecting it, I think, at about 470,000 this coming year. If they don't tinker with the formula, growing communities will tend to benefit from it more over time than the ones that are not growing. They'll either stay static or start to move slightly backwards, but I think that's what we've got it projected.
If they do take it away, we're looking at somewhere in the $500,000 mark shortfall.
Yep. And then the last one I wanted to talk about here was the franchise fee. The council did authorize as part of the budget approval process last year, moving forward with the implementation of a franchise fee. The franchise fee is a fee that gets tacked onto the franchised utilities. So electric and gas have operating franchises with the City of Marion, and this is a percentage that gets put onto the utility bills. We endorsed putting in 3% and intended to move forward with that project. What we ran into an issue with is that it seems like between Mid-American, REC, and Alliant, they have virtually every attorney in the major metro area locked up in one way or another. I even reached out to the city attorney in Hiawatha, and he had done work for Alliant, and none of them will waive the conflict of interest. So we had a heck of a time trying to find an attorney who could work on that negotiation on our behalf. So I did ask our city attorney to take a look into that. So Kara has spent some time doing research, learning that side of the equation, and has now given us a draft of a proposed franchise agreement that we can use to get that project moving forward. It would be a 3% fee that would be charged on every gas and electric bill. We'd have to have 3, Mid-American, Lynn REC, and Alliant to be able to do that. It's subject to a reverse referendum, which means that, we can put that piece into the franchise agreements, which gives the council the legal authority to implement a franchise fee, but then you actually have to pass an ordinance to implement it, and the voters do have the right to say we want that to go out to public vote. It doesn't commonly happen, but it did happen in Burlington, where they put it on there, and they had a reverse referendum, and the voters said no. So we have that budgeted in there for next year at about $1.35 million. So if we move forward with it and something like that were to happen, that's a significant hit to next year's budget, and we're going to have to really retool a lot of things in there. Even as we move forward with it now, we know that starting today, we would not start collecting it on July 1. So we're going to be a little bit behind on that. I think that based on the schedule we're looking at right now, we could start to receive it as soon as September, but we have to work through that with the utilities and keep moving that forward. Now, one of the keys to that I want the council to understand is it's not a straight 3% increase, because right now everybody pays local option sales tax on their utility bills. The franchise fee replaces the local option sales tax. So overall, it's a 2% increase to the utility bills versus a 3% increase. Means that the Lynn County pool sees a bit less coming in for the overall local option sales tax. It gets distributed to the communities. If we figure that our total estimate is about $450,000 per penny on the franchise fees. That's about what gets taken out of the Lynn County pool. It's not a one-for-one reduction in what Marion receives, because we're a net beneficiary. So for every $100,000 we put in, we get $120,000 back. So we would not expect to see a penny-for-penny reduction in the amount that Marion gets by the Lynn County pool overall going down. But really, that one is driven largely by consumer behavior and consumer spending. So the state gives us estimates on what they would project. As we implement the franchise fee, they would adjust their projections to show for that. So we'd be able to know where we would likely be heading with local option sales tax collections. Cedar Rapids does have a 3% franchise fee, so we are not putting ourselves out of competition in the metro market by doing that. Hiawatha has contemplated it, but they have not implemented it yet.
Lon, what constitutes a utility? Are we including what's left of landline services, optic fiber, cable, cell phones, et cetera?
Those pay a different type of franchise fees. So, for example, a cable company, if Marion has a franchise fee with them, they would pay a separate amount. Typically, our franchise agreements with them call for 5% of revenues. And so if you look at the revenue line items in the general fund budget, you'll see a franchise fees amount usually between $300,000 and $350,000. That's our cable services that have franchises with us. So MediaComs, honestly, those companies, unless we've done a new one, have changed names and been sold and consolidated so many times. Our actual franchise agreement might be with TCI of the Heartland, but MediaCom is now the owner of that franchise agreement. So they're done separately.
Okay, thank you.
I'm a little confused still. Because if I look at the line item, historically we've averaged about $350,000 for franchise fees. We budgeted $1,350,000 in our current budget, and then we're also budgeting that same amount for 2020. So what you're saying is that extra 3% we're talking about is really not happening.
Not in the current fiscal year.
Not in the current fiscal year, but Cedar Rapids has it, and we can't get it. But so clarify again why we have not been able to enact that.
Cedar Rapids had their legal staff do their franchise agreements. That was not something that our legal staff had expertise in, so we tried to find an attorney who had done that negotiations and worked that out on behalf of smaller communities. We had a hard time finding anybody, and so we just, thinking about September, October, elected to say to our legal staff, go out and learn how to do this, and that's what we've done. I didn't anticipate running into the problem of being able to find a contract attorney to be able to do that, but I mean, I must have called a dozen or 15 and just ran into that problem. Either their firm had Alliant or Mid-American or REC, or all of them as a client, or the individual attorneys had done work for them.
So how are we absorbing that difference in the budget, since we are going to be $1 million short? in the current year budget?
The big thing that we do is we take a look at how we performed the prior year. What did our cash balance actually look like?
Right.
And the cash balance from the prior year, we underspent by quite a wide margin, so it wasn't critical that we have that right away throughout the fiscal year. At one of our last staff meetings, I did also ask the departments to really take a close look at the last 6 months of this year for operating budgets, and if we don't need to spend the money, let's not spend the money, to make sure that we don't hit this fiscal year below the 35%.
So where are we underspending to offset that?
A lot of times where we'll underspend is if you look at the general fund, you can go, well, we could give you a report for last year's budget, and you could go through it line item by line item if you'd like to kind of see where we underspent. But it can be things as simple as, we've got a budgeted expense for replacing a piece of equipment that gets delayed and moved into the next fiscal year. It can be that someone left and that their successor in the position is at a lower cost, or we'll hold a position open for a couple of months while we do the recruitment, and those dollars don't get spent out of the general fund. Sometimes it's due to better than expected claims history on the medical insurance side. But when you comb through a $21 to $22 million general fund, and it doesn't take long if you're saving 1% here or 1% there or 2% here or 2% there to add up to some fairly substantial numbers.
So theoretically then, if we're able in the current fiscal year to offset that $1 million, then if we wanted to have a flat property tax levy rate, we could find a way to offset that $450,000 that we're overspending in the current proposed budget draft.
Yeah, actually, if you were to take a look at, well, we'll get into that with general fund a little bit later, because right now it does have a structural deficit. I'm sure we can narrow that, but sometimes that's as simple as the decision of where we're targeting our percentage at the end. If we're presenting to you a draft budget that brings it in at 39%, the council can make the decision to say, let's get closer to that 35% and see where our property tax levy ends up. It just depends on how much margin for error you'd like to be able to leave in there. I usually try to budget between 35 and 39%. There have been years where I've budgeted at like 35.1, but then if you get to the end of the year and you actually come in at 40% or 40, some years where we've done really well, we've come in at 43%, then you do quite well. One of the drivers, for example, in the general fund is how much we're paying for utilities. A couple of years ago, Alliant was going into the Iowa Utilities Board with a 13% increase on their rate case. And so we budgeted anticipating that we could get hit with as much as a 13% utility increase. Iowa Utilities Board did not approve that 13%, and so at the end of the year, we had that money then that we could carry forward. So there's a lot of pieces like that that we will try to anticipate with this, but until we actually get the final number, there's still unknowns in the budget. Even the medical insurance rate that I quoted, if it's at 3.7%, that's an initial rate that we get from Wellmark for their best estimates, but they're giving us that estimate based on at most 2 quarters worth of performance in the current fiscal year. And so, as we get closer to our actual renewal, they may come in and say it's actually this. There's only been 1 year since I've been here where they've come back to us and said that it was higher than the initial quoted rates. Most of the time it either is the initial quoted rates, and sometimes it's a little bit lower. Make sense? Questions? Right. So one of the things I wanted to dive into a little bit more on the general fund side is just that impact of commercial and industrial properties. I know that this is something we talk about a lot with diversification of Marion's property tax base and the need to make sure that we get more balance in that. This just breaks that down so you can get an idea of what it takes for development to generate $1 million in new property taxes for the city of Marion. So it takes about 726 houses, or if you look at LPLAST's, it takes 22 of those. Now, why is that important? Think about the difference in infrastructure and utilities that it takes to support those two uses. 726 houses on 6 say 6 houses per acre is going to translate into a lot more street, a lot more sewer to take care of than one LPLAST that might have 1 street or 2 streets around their entire site. So the net yield, the net benefit, is a much larger increase or a much larger benefit to the property tax base that does not necessarily have a corresponding demand on services. That's not typical on all commercial. I think Chief McHale and Chief Crable will tell you that if you have a hotel, you can expect to provide a higher level of service to a hotel than you might to, say, a legacy manufacturing, just because of the concentration of people that you have there, that they're going to have to respond more often than they would, say, to a typical factory. But it's important for us to provide that diversification. The other reason that that's important is because when you look at the levy amounts that change a lot as far as their taxable value under the state rollback, residential is the one that swings the most. Commercial and industrial are fixed at 90%, so we know from year to year that commercial and industrial property, what their value is going to be. It's steady and predictable. But residential is really closely tied to agricultural values. So residential has been pretty steady for the last 5, 6, 7 years at around 55, 56%. But back in 2007, 2008, on a $100,000 house, you paid taxes on it as if it was worth $44,000. And so for a community like Marion, where a big percentage of our property tax base is tied up in residential, a 1% swing in rollback to the negative on residential has a huge impact on our taxable value. And where that makes me a little bit nervous is what happens if it's a year where you get a 3% rollback in residential value. When I started in this business, it was right when that was really starting to take shape, and I can remember years where the residential rollback would drop 9% from year to year. And in a community like Marion, that would be a huge hit. Now, what that does is it shifts property taxes amongst your classifications, and that's what I worry about when you hear folks talking, for example, at the legislature about property taxes, and we're hearing from people about property taxes. Well, it's kind of a self-created problem, because when they implemented the commercial and industrial rollback, I don't think city officials had much of a quibble about that, because it was trying to make the system more equitable. But at the same time, they didn't really acknowledge or understand that when you did that, if Marion's property tax asking is $21 million, we still are asking for $21 million. If this category is paying less, that means that this category is paying more. So, at one point you're hearing a lot from the business community about their property taxes, so you do something for the business community, but without taking a holistic view and saying, well, here's the residential piece. All that does is result in a shift to the residential side, and then they start hearing from the residential folks about their property taxes are going up. It could be through absolutely no action of the city on that. Even if we were holding our property tasks asks straight from year to year, you'd still see one category go up versus another one. So as the general fund is constituted right now, we do have some expectations in revenue. One that I wanted to talk about a bit was the housing inspection and licensing. This was one that we talked about last year with council about the need to increase the number of inspectors that we have on staff. And if you look in the general fund budget, one of the biggest sources of revenue is our current building inspection fees, our building permit fees. Those are ones that are collected, as the name would imply, are for the costs of issuance of building permits. Residential is not that expensive, but we have had a lot of commercial construction happening in Marion. Commercial ones have pretty significant building permit fees associated with them. It's not unusual to, like if a school, for example, is going to be built, that you could have a school building permit, depending on the size of it, could be as much as $100,000. We have been asked by the schools in the past to waive those. We have said no, because we have to have inspectors at those buildings a lot. I mean, when they start to build something of that scale and that size, it is a huge commitment of time on our behalf. And past councils have felt that, we can't provide that service for free because of just the commitment of time and personnel that it takes to be able to monitor one of those projects. So one of the projects that the staff has been working on is coming up with a housing inspection and licensing fee. We do have one now. The residential or the multi-residential properties are on a 3-year rotation, minimum 3-year rotation for having inspections done. What we'd like to do is to propose a fee schedule for the council that actually would pay for the cost of providing that service, because right now that's being paid for out of the general fund. If you look at the difference between the amount of the collections that are coming in on building permits and how much is actually allocated towards the building inspection division of community development, the main difference between collections and expenses is the cost of the housing program. And I didn't get into it too much talking about the state property tax change, but when they changed the formula for commercial and industrial, they also changed and created a whole new category called multi-residential. So whereas before your large multifamily complexes would have been charged as commercial, they're shifting over to multi-residential. So between now and 2024, every year their property taxes are going down. They're getting phased down to the residential rollback. So if you look at the way they're set up right now, they're stepping down from 90% down to the current 55. So they're seeing significant reductions in property taxes over the years. We didn't, and philosophically, I never worried about having to have that housing inspection program be self-sufficient as long as they were classified as commercial properties, because they were paying for a higher share of property taxes than a typical residential house. But when you think of it in terms of the demand that they create, we do not need to send our inspectors out every year, every 2 years, or every 3 years to inspect a single-family home just to make sure it's safe for the people that are living there. The owners that are landlords versus the owners that are living in the properties that they own. If you're living in the house that you own and you decide to disable your smoke detectors, you're putting yourself and your family at risk. If you have a residential unit that you're renting out and you choose to do that, you're putting someone else's lives at risk. And so there's a significant difference there in how that works. And at the same time, we also do it to protect those property owners so that the people that live there aren't disabling the smoke detectors, and they end up taking on a significant loss because of the actions of the tenants. So it's a dual purpose. But as they've been phasing down, the amount that they're contributing towards the general fund and therefore towards building inspection is going down a couple $1 million worth of value every year, just in the interest in being equitable and equal and trying to make sure that those creating the demand are paying for it. We're going to be proposing a schedule of fees to the council to cover the cost of that position.
We talked about this a year ago. Is there a reason that we have not put this into force yet or had the proposal come to the city council before?
We haven't done the hiring for it yet, and the two are tied together. And so we have been working on it. I think in about March we'll be bringing the proposal over to the council for your consideration.
Okay.
Lon, what would the average permit go up to make this a cost neutral? I know we've talked about that, and that escapes my memory as to what that general dollar was. Can you, just a ballpark figure?
Yeah, we're targeting between 100 and 130,000 for revenue to support the position. I think right now we have a little over 4,400 multifamily units. So even if you just divided it out, you'd end up with, I can't remember off the top of my head what the number is.
$30.
Yeah, that's
Gary's
okay.
here if he knows. Do you remember off the top of your head? But if you think about that, I mean, multifamily units are now fully a third of Marion's housing stock. I mean, at 4,400 of them, that's about a third of the units in the city. And we have ones that are going to be coming in fairly large numbers. The rezoning that council has been considering out there off of Furno Road is going to add a significant amount. We have 100 that are under construction for Bison Ridge. We've got potentially 150 coming in the uptown, another 50 over on the old EIC site. So there's a significant workload that's going to be coming with new units.
When we talk, oops, I'm sorry, go ahead, Gary.
It's going to average around $25 a unit. Obviously, if you have, a larger unit, it's going to be more than. We worked it out so that if you have a 100-unit facility, you're going to pay somewhere around $550. If you have a single unit, it's probably going to be somewhere around the 50 or 75 for something like that. So worked it out so that you don't need terribly if you have a larger facility.
And that's obviously then prorated out over a 3-year cycle, correct?
We're figuring a 2-year cycle, so every other year they'll get a charge like that.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that when we talk about inspections that I can't help get out of my mind is also to the Fire Prevention Bureau. My biggest concern is with new construction, things that need our diligent attention to as well too. Are we collecting any fees on that to help subsidize that particular portion of the department? And what does the future look like there as far as we know we're understaffed in the Prevention Bureau as well too, with the amount of growth that we have and new construction coming online and reconstruction, things of that nature. Can you touch on that one just for a second?
Chief, do you want to take that one?
Yes, we do have a fee that we charge for the fire alarm systems, the fire sprinkler systems, for us to review those plans. But they haven't been changed in a long time, and we're actually reviewing them within the next couple months to see if we should maybe raise those.
Is that something that would be able to help sustain either current or future positions in that department, such as this for the building department?
No.
No, we do not. Okay.
Not enough.
Okay.
Yeah, we know that that's going to be something that's going to be a continuing need. We're with the budget as it's constituted right now, it does include the next round of firefighter hiring, which means that we'll have hired 12 firefighters over a succession of 5 fiscal years. This last round is critical to allowing the chief to implement the battalion chief position that will really facilitate the command of having 3 stations online. And so with that, I consider that to be kind of a stranded commitment. But every time you add that, full freight of entry-level firefighters, that's $250,000 plus in a full fiscal year. So we've been putting those in place. And it's just a question of how much can you commit, knowing that you have needs in other public safety departments and engineering and planning and other areas as well. It's just trying to maintain that balance of resources. It would be a position that I think that the chief has requested, and it's going to continue to be a priority. But we have to be not in what I would consider to be an automatic hiring mode for 3 positions per year to be able to slot that one in.
Right. My only concern, though, is we've got, correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, we've got 1 committed full-time for new inspector, help me out here. Are both positions for new construction? I know what our protocol has been in the past. I mean, there's only 2 people. There's going to be scheduled vacations, time off, things of that nature that we're just going to have to start giving something up. To me, Lon, those are 2 different topics. It's kind of like breaking up communications with the police. It's its own entity. We either have to be proactive in doing the inspections or reactive in responding to fire calls. I guess that's just the core. I'm just cutting right to the chase. So how are we positioning that? We must be taking something off the table. Is Sean fully doing the same thing as the chief of prevention?
We're trying to get Sean up to speed to be able to do plan review. That's what Wade does for all the fire alarm systems and the sprinkler systems. There's special training and certifications to be able to do that. We've had trouble finding classes for Sean to attend to do that, but we've been training him in-house at this time. So right now, Wade's pretty much in charge of all the new building construction, really, that's throughout the city. Sean's more of the inspector. So the more commercial we get, we've been given some of our inspections to the firefighters themselves to get them into the buildings so they can see what they're like and things like that, training them in inspections also. We're trying to work around it. We are realigning our inspection plan, which means that a lot of the businesses that we did every 2 years, we might do every 3. But we are trying to work around it and trying to find solutions until we can get another person, and we'll just continue working on that.
Okay, thank you. I just know as a growth that concerns me. New construction, I know what Wade's schedule is. I know, I know what's going on. Sheetrock is going up before we can inspect sprinkler systems, iron piping. We're not keeping up in that area, and I know that. And there's a lot of things I know we're not keeping up at. These are Band-Aids that we're dealing with, and I know at some point all this new construction is drastically going to slow down a little bit. But again, I'm going to go back to the saying that my office gets inspected every year, and that takes man-hours to do that. And I know it's a quick 15-minute inspection. There's not a lot of change in my office, but as our city continues to grow, I'm going to continue to keep pushing these issues with a couple of these significant, what I feel are significant areas. I mean, you can only imagine to go out to a hotel and inspect 88 rooms, how much labor that takes. And I'm not picking on any one department, but I just know when that's being done, something else is not being done. So I'm just very passionate about a couple of these departments that, again, it's a proactive, reactive. You're on one side of the table or the other. So I think it's something that we got to figure out, because I'm just concerned that, again, we put ourselves in positions where something happens, there's a medical condition, and somebody goes out, we're stuck. We're not taking care of these categories like I think we should be. So that just bothers me a little bit here. So anyway. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and now one of the reasons that I had that the franchise fee is listed here is because there are opportunities at the council. If you decide that it's a priority that we do some of those things, you do have some opportunities to do it. We've got the franchise fee for gas and electric programmed in at 3%. If you said, one of the things that we have to do is to do a revenue purpose statement for those franchise fees. And I think I've said from the beginning that I think the revenue purpose statement should be to use it for public safety activities. If the council wanted to say, we're going to do 4%, well, that 4% is going to produce several $100,000. You as a council could say, we are willing to do that because we want to fund additional resources going to fire inspection or communications. You have the ability to do that as a council. That is not a revenue source that we're proposing to fully tap at this point. You do have a statutory limitation of 5% that you can put towards that, but that's one of the ones that's under the control and discretion of the council on what that rate is, and then where those revenues get dedicated. You also have the emergency levy. The emergency levy in the initial draft budget is not proposed to be used. If you put it in at a third, which is what we did last year, that's about $120,000 to $140,000, which is enough to fund a fire inspector position. So you as a council, if you want to take some of those or make some changes to what we have proposed in the draft budget, that's fully your decision or your discretion to say, no, we'd rather focus resources here. But there are areas that you could exercise under your discretion to put additional resources towards some of those functions.
Could we go, and I hate to keep beating this one up a little bit though, but can we go back to looking at what the permit fees and costs are associated with that? And can we absorb more of that in these larger permits that are being pulled? I mean, for example, hotel, I'm trying to think of how many man hours can we put associated with that, and should those permits and fees be more relative to what we're doing with rental properties and trying to absorb a lot of that, because it takes care of itself. When we do get to the plateau where we're no longer building out and it becomes more stagnant, then the department can readjust and prioritize within the department and justify itself. I'm trying to figure out ways to leverage generating that those resources for that.
Thank you for the segue.
You're welcome. That was unscripted.
I was going to say, too, that we haven't raised our building permit fees for, I don't know, the 6.5 years that I've been here. And I know Cedar Rapids recently has adjusted their fees. And we were going to kind of look at that maybe this next year sometime, but we have not got to that point yet. So
And I know there's going to be opposition of that, but and working in the industry that I do too, there's a cost of doing business. And so when people are renting property, that is business. In the state of Iowa, that is business pursuits. And so for the associated fees should be right along with that. Your insurance is more expensive. The structure of how that's going to be run and handled is going to be a little bit more different, just like other things that we're going to be talking about in the future about separate meters for multifamily, and multi-businesses. So I appreciate that, Gary, and it's probably something that is critical that we really fine-tooth, go that stuff through that stuff with a fine-tooth comb, because there's, I think, a lot of things that we just can't continue to keep absorbing those for the benefits of those pursuits. So.
I agree, and I think you're right there. But we also want to have a happy medium. We don't want to be so much higher than.
Totally agree. I totally agree.
Send all of our housing to them. So.
Exactly.
Weigh that a little bit.
Yep. Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So to take that one step further, I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the proposals for this future year is there are some projects that are a little bit longer term that we want to spend some time on and work on to bring back proposals to the council. One is to take a very close look at our costing model for that enterprise and proprietary fund support. We based our current numbers off of an analysis we did clear back in 2009, 2010. So, for example, a portion of my salary gets allocated out to sanitary sewer. A portion of the city engineer's salary gets allocated towards sanitary sewer. But those were based off of snapshots in time taken of how much time are you dedicating to supporting that particular function. So if I'm in the middle of working with Ryan on renegotiating our sanitary sewer agreement with Cedar Rapids, that number is going to be higher than it would be in a typical year. Finance is going to be relatively steady because, back then we would have based it on the proportion. We would have looked at, okay, here's the overall budget. Sanitary sewer is 10% of the consolidated budget. Therefore, sanitary sewer should pay for 10% of finance. But that's one measure. We wanted to dive into it more deeply and develop costing models based on how much activity it actually takes. Because, for example, sanitary sewer might be 10% of your cash, but what percentage is it of your actual transactions? We receive property taxes twice a year. So how much does that take? Work does that actually take relative to booking sanitary sewer revenues and running the activity of that division every month? So that'll be something that will help us to develop a more robust costing model and really make sure that those proprietary funds are actually paying their fair share of what they should be covering for those indirect services. I think, as council knows, we also are going to be launching a compensation study for the city. That's an area that, if you look at our traditional model of how compensation is set, we know it's outdated, but we want to have some really good data about what is the market out there, what should we be using, but also as part of that, rather than just adjusting base pay as your only strategy really for compensation, we want to get some feedback for some other methods that are out there. The private sector has gotten a lot more creative than that than the public sector has, and we really want to take a holistic look at what can we do other than just raising base pay. As part of that, one of the things I think that people are going to have to realize is that, salaries cannot continue to endlessly go up. As you reach the top of a wage band, there will be a top of a wage band, and that's just something we're going to have to deal with, but we need good data to know where those numbers should actually be. So that'll be coming forward. We have not budgeted for changes in hotel-motel revenues. We know Prospect Meadows is targeting Memorial Day for opening. The Town Place Suites down here is looking at wanting to be on that same timeline so that they can be opening in May or June. Whether they'll hit it or not, I don't know. They got thrown a curveball with having windows back ordered, and that had an impact on their overall construction schedule. But we haven't budgeted for that. We know that those numbers are going to go up, but they're incredibly hard for us to project. I can look at what the hotel projected, but I don't know how or when that will be reflected in our collections. So we haven't budgeted for that. But when you start talking about things like funding emergency services, we know that Prospect Meadows will generate calls for medical calls. There will be police calls out there. We can use up to 50% of hotel motel revenues for operating expenses and for general use. 50% needs to be reserved back to be used for activities that actually create and generate tourism. But as that hotel comes online and then the Country Inn and Suites comes in online out on Highway 13, we'll see a significant increase in Marion in the overall collections there. So council will have the ability to make some of those allocations in future budgets. And then the last one is just to build on what Councilman Sternad was talking about is we hope that the council continues to be open to additional and different fees for service. I'm going to put this one in a little bit of a different context. Building permit fees bring in about $700,000 a year, and that pays for a lot of the cost of building inspections. Planning brings in about $12,000. And I think Tom is fond of saying that, they charge $50 for filing a permit fee. It costs $50 just to take it and put it in the system. As we develop these costing models, one of the things that we want to do is really, truly understand from start to finish what does it cost to model out and do a subdivision and propose to the council ways that we can equalize those costs, because we are subsidizing the bejesus out of new development right now. And that is a technical term in the city manager's world.
I'm going to Google that.
But we need to understand how much. I can sit here and tell you that yes, we are, and I know that we are, but how much and how much can we push back on that without damaging and really slowing down the rate of development in the community? I think Mike Barkalow said that Cedar Rapids now charges, I think, 5% for the costs of doing a subdivision. So if the subdivision costs $500,000 to do, they pay 5% of that cost to the city up front for engineering and engineering inspection. They're doing that. Their model has been different than ours. They don't do as robust of inspection of street pours and things like that. That's been causing them some problems, so they're raising their fees to be commensurate with that. But that presents an opportunity for us to look at those fees and not put ourselves out of line with the market and be able to start moving towards more the cost of development paying for itself. The CIP, for example, contemplates us starting to charge some kind of a parkland dedication fee. What shape that will take, we don't know exactly for sure, but if you have a 380-unit development proposed, like the one the council just considered east of Highway 13, that's going to generate and accelerate our need to fully develop that park that we have out there. It'll bring that project forward, because when we looked at it and put it into the CIP, we thought, well, this is when that area is likely to develop. Now it's all coming in at the same time. And we need to have a mechanism to be able to ensure that everybody isn't paying for that, which is what happens now. Thankfully, the local option sales tax has really bolstered a lot of that, but we've used that for a lot of enhancements to existing parks and not necessarily for build out of future parks. So we cannot charge 100% of the cost of that to the developer, because when that went to the Supreme Court, that was what they really rested on, is that you were telling the developer, hey, Mr. Developer, you have to build this 30-acre park at 100% your cost, but at the end of that, it's going to have a huge benefit to the entire community. So the argument was is you can't charge one individual for the cost of something that provides a generalized community benefit. But I do think there is a balance there that can be achieved between, okay, if our total housing stock is 10,000 and you're adding 1,000, you should pay 10% of the cost of that based on what additional demand you're actually creating.
So if the Supreme Court said that they couldn't charge 100%, did they give parameters of what could be charged?
If I recall that decision correctly, believe it or not, the Supreme Court said that's what debt is for.
Whoops.
I kid you not. Because general fund, general obligation debt goes against every property that pays property taxes. Yeah.
I mean,
One of my favorite decisions of the last 25 years.
Yeah, I'm always okay for user fees, but in the areas you're talking about here, are you hearing from, in your city manager meetings when you talk to other cities, that these are trends that are becoming a little more constant in the state or the Midwest?
You know, it's something that, especially in communities that are growing, they really take a look at. I think if you were to look, I mean, we can pull up some lists from places like West Des Moines and Urbandale and Waukee, but they charge, and Ankeny, they charge significantly more than we do. Nobody in Iowa is doing a 100% costing model where they're recovering everything.
I'd agree.
It's making its way slowly into Iowa, more from across the Midwest.
Okay.
During my time in Wisconsin, you could look at departments there that were, or communities that were growing quickly, where their entire planning department budget was based off fees for services. And, you know, a developer would come in and they'd put down a $1,000 deposit on doing a subdivision review, and the city would run it through the process and track their hours, and then at the end they might write a check back to the developer for $150, but they were charging what it actually cost to do it.
By the hour.
Iowa's philosophy, and frankly, I think this is a carryover from the tough economy days. At one point, Iowa was so desperate for development, they said any development is good development, and we want to keep our fees absolutely as low as we can. And that philosophy has continued forward, for better or worse. I think that's where it springs from, is the idea that you have to do everything you can just to get building permits pulled. And if, you know, you were a community in the area of the state where I grew up, where a big year is having 3 new houses built, you may want to have that philosophy. In areas where there is high demand and where demographic changes in the state are going to continue to push that, I think we can push that envelope safely a bit more without having a material impact on the rate of development in the community.
Well, it certainly doesn't seem to be impacting development in the Des Moines area that you talked about. No.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
they have that same level of competition, if not more than we do, because people can choose Ankeny or Johnston or Urbandale or Waukee or West Des Moines or Altoona. They have an entire menu of options.
Totally.
I mean, I for one am open to looking at that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk about the hotel motel a little bit more, because right now hotel motel is what we use to fund our community tourism grant program, community attraction and tourism program. So other than the piece that we use to allocate towards, we do a little bit of an allocation for our costs for police and fire and parks to support events. So, you know, if we have to pay a little bit of overtime to support the Swamp Fox Parade and direct traffic, we do a little bit of an allocation for that. But other than that, 100% of the remainder is dedicated towards that grant program. As those revenue sources grow and as those other hotels come online and tourism increases, only 50% is actually restricted to those uses. So we will have more flexibility in there. But like I said, we haven't anticipated it in this budget because we don't know, one, when does the hotel open? How long does it take them to stabilize? When will they actually be hitting their full amount? But if you were to look at communities that I would say are very similar to us, you know, Bettendorf is the one that springs to mind, Cedar Falls, because those are 2 communities where they're the primary largest community around a major urban area versus, say, the Waukees and the Urbandales. It's not unusual to see $1 million plus a year coming in on hotel motel revenues. We've been at 180,000 since I've been here, mainly just driven because we have not seen hotel development. Almost all the new hotel development has been to our southwest, and now we're finally starting to see some of it coming our direction.
Is that something that Lon, maybe we should be looking at to find out what that model should look like? I mean, we currently already have motels in town, and maybe we should be looking at, again, I just keep going back to the philosophy that the city should be run like a business, and that is it should cash flow itself on all of the services provided for the majority, perspective. So if we are hosting security or providing services, from the city for those events and things, that should be built in. It would be nice to be ready to go so that when we're talking about the budgets next year, that it's already there. Is there models out there that we can look at to see, if there is a percentage or how that flows itself?
Yeah, that's part of developing that costing model, so we know what those direct and indirect costs are, so we can look back and say, we know that on the Swamp Pox Parade, we are going to incur X amount of hours of overtime. If we're going to incur X amount of hours of overtime, we should charge that back to hotel motel. We've just been doing it as a stable allocation just to make sure that we do have money to support those other activities, because that grant program is designed around activities that bring people to Marion and help increase the tourism dollars. The idea is you want to invest part of it into doing things that increase your hotel stays so that you continue to build that number over time. Our primary limitation is simply on number of rooms and what do they actually charge. You know, the microtel generally is fairly full, but it's not, you know, a top-tier hotel as far as what they charge for room rates per night. The hard thing, and why when I look at the town place suites, it's difficult to figure out exactly what that number would be, is one, when do they open? And then it's not uncommon when you have something like Prospect Meadows out there for them to want to come in and designate a room block, and that's a negotiated rate, which is different than your standard rate as what they have published. And I have no idea what that mix is going to be. There's a trade-off there because the hotel will say, okay, I'm going to allow you to have this rate, but you're going to guarantee this usage in this room block. They'll trade off 100% occupancy for a little bit different amount per room. Then Prospect Meadows and Perfect Game tell people when you come in, if you're going to be one of our registered teams, you have to stay at this hotel. So I don't know how that model will work out. It was going to be handled by Go Cedar Rapids, and they did have a model put together that I could have kind of projected off of, but now it's going to be taken over by Prospect Meadows and Perfect Game, and I just don't have that data.
Sure, and I understand and appreciate that. And I just for the benefit of the audience, again, it's just when we start talking about overtime, you know, we don't realize what the impact is from a financial burden. So whatever that negotiated rate is for overtime, but you also have workman's comp, you've got IPERS, you've got fire police pensions, everything is relative to that. So what might have been costing you $20 an hour is going to cost you $35 an hour for that overtime. So it's a huge impact. I think that software will be a great asset for us to be using. So thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have a quick status report on the Country Inn and Suites? Obviously, they're going to miss the first Prospect Meadows season. So is there any updated report on that?
From what I understand, they are actually waiting on Prospect Meadows to see how it looks after that first season. They were initially looking at a groundbreaking in May to construct that, but I think they want to see how that facility looks for a few months before they would break ground. So it's still planned out there, but it's been delayed a bit. Now, one thing on that one is because of the nature of the economic development agreement that we did with that one, they also are giving up some potential revenue that would come back to them by doing that. So
I wonder why what that looks like impacts how they build and when they build. Are they thinking they may change their scale or modify their plans?
Not 100% sure. Unlike the one that was done over here where they shared their hotel, basically their hotel analysis with us, the one out at Squaw Creek Crossing has not done that, so I don't know what their projections are or what they're based off of.
Okay.
It's a whole different investment group.
Yep. Thank you. We'll let you get back to your itinerary.
No, that's okay. So from there, we'll move into our discussion of the proprietary and enterprise funds. Now with the proprietary funds, again, same kind of format, talking about revenues, what our constraints are, what our FY20 expectations are, and then future outlook for revenues on that. So with the proprietary funds, you know, this one we have our five usual suspects: road use, sanitary sewer, solid waste, stormwater, and urban forest. Road use is driven by the revenue that we collect from the state. That's primarily the only source of money that comes into that. In the past, we have supplemented that a little bit with a couple of other ways that we can look at allocating the cost of employee benefits, but that's been in years where that fund was really in jeopardy of going into the red towards the end of a decade. Sanitary sewer, all of these are based off of a fee-for-service model, and philosophically they need to be able to pay their own way. When you talk, Randy, about running them like a business, these are business units and should be fully self-supporting business units of the city of Marion. They are not all that way. Urban forest, for example, is a fairly new one, and it's one that we wanted to phase in fairly slowly. We primarily were looking at that as a way to make sure that we had a stable source of funding, knowing that the costs of managing our urban forest and canopy were not what we were allocating in resources wasn't anywhere close to what it was actually needed to be done. So we've been doing a lot of catch-up, but we also built up some funding reserves knowing that the emerald ash borer was going to hit us hard, and it was just a matter of when, not if. The scary thing is that there's actually another threat out there that is much more devastating than the emerald ash borer that thankfully hasn't been seen here yet, but has been found in some cases in Illinois. It's the Asian longhorn beetle, because it does not discriminate against trees on the basis of species. It goes after everything. And the only way you can stop the proliferation of that one is when you find it in a tree, you clear cut. Now, I don't remember if the radius is 1/4 of a mile or a 1/2 mile around it, but you take everything out because it's based on how far that beetle can travel. So when it shows up, it's devastating to a community. But that one, as a fairly new utility, does not have any allocations towards it for the operating support. So we don't charge anything for finance or administration to that utility. Again, because it's fairly new and we wanted to give people time to adapt to the idea that we had that. But it wasn't all that long ago that we were only putting $75,000 a year towards our urban forest management. We were spending about $25,000 to $35,000 out of road use for street trees, and then about $40,000 a year out of the general fund. And that was not even enough really to keep up with storm damage, let alone do any type of active or proactive management associated with it. So road use, this is the one where our disbursements really are tied to population. So the next bump that we would expect to see in that would be after the 2020 census. And, Marion's going to continue to gain population. Other areas of the state that stay stagnant or move backwards will see either a reduction in revenue or a stabilization of revenue. But this is an area where being a growing community definitely works in our favor. When we did the 2016 special census, we gained hundreds of thousands in additional revenue towards that. This is an area, though, that being able to budget for that and set up a reserve to do that special census is absolutely critical. We have a special census reserve fund in our chart of accounts. It doesn't have any money in it right now. Starting in about 2021, 2022, we're going to want to start budgeting and putting money into that account so we have money set aside to do a special census. After, I think, the mid-2000 special censuses, might have been the mid-90s special censuses, a lot of communities actually used road use funds to pay for doing the special census, and the state came in and said, no, you can't do that. So to pay for the special census, you have to have another source of funding. So we have, the last time around, we started budgeting, $35,000, $45,000 a year to put into a special fund to be able to pay for that when it came around. But as a growing community, the reason that is critical for us is because if you look at decades where we have not been able to do that, Ryan's crews, as you add miles of streets and as you add areas of responsibility, you end up having to add personnel. As the infrastructure ages during the course of the decade, your older streets are going to require more maintenance. They're just taking on a lot more responsibility. So if we don't see that mid-decade bump in road use tax, what happens is you get to the end of the decade and you're drawing significantly against fund balance in order to be able to make it work. I think when we ended 2010, we were down to the point where we had maybe $350,000, $400,000 sitting in that account. And we usually like to maintain at least my philosophy, I like big fund balances. Everybody tells me we should maintain 60 to 90 days worth of fund reserves. I like to have more than that. So when you get down to the point where you only have $350,000 against a $3 million budget, I start to get really, really nervous. So that's very critical that we do that. Utility rates, we've talked a lot about this one, about some of the inequities that are built into our fee models. And so when we look at these, we're going to be proposing to the council that we put revenue targets in there, but then we'll come back to you with specific rate recommendations and fee recommendations that actually will hit that revenue target but make our rates more equitable. The most obvious one is simply Sanitary sewer, because we've talked about that a lot, that because there's a meter charge on there, a single-family home might pay an average of $29 a month, but a fourplex where it only has one meter might be paying $18 a month for consuming the same amount of sanitary sewer. And so what we want to do is move to more of a consumption model so that as you're actually paying for the load that you're creating. Now, why do we do that? Because right now, there's really not much of incentive to do things to reduce your flow. The primary charge for a lot of people is, the monthly fee, and the consumption, unless you're going over the basic allotment that is included in that fee, you're not paying anything additional on that. In the past, because of our wastewater agreement with Cedar Rapids, there also really wasn't an incentive for us to go to a flow-based model. But with our new pending agreement with Cedar Rapids being based on flow, everything that we can do to incentivize people to reduce their flow means that we will pay Cedar Rapids less as well. So there's a direct relationship that'll be established between what we pay as a community to the cost of treatment for Cedar Rapids and what the contributors put into the system on the other end. So we may be able to come back to you with something where a single-family homeowner might not see a fee increase if we're able to just equalize it across all the classifications of property and rely less on that static monthly fee and more on a consumption-based model. So that's why I don't want to say, it's going to be an average of $1 per house, because there's opportunities to fix that more equitably across classifications of property. And for the first time, there's really actually going to be a net benefit to us as a community for doing that. And then we'll have the impacted changes for stabilizing and really diving more deeply into that indirect costing model. I can't predict for you right now whether that means that the proprietary funds would fund more or less of a particular department. What I suspect will happen is that instead of having some basic parity, for example, between my department and finance department may see more allocations, my department might see less, but then we'll also have a formula in there for understanding, okay, how much of the operating budget for City Hall as a building, and some of those are actually being based on a more scientific formula. Right now, like I said, we're doing it based off of a snapshot in time, and then just also some flat allocations that are being transferred in from the proprietary funds. The other thing that is going to be an impact on the enterprise fund revenues is, as we went through the CIP process, we are looking to those for a higher expectation of capital project support. Right now, the fee increases that are proposed through the current CIP are really related to annual programs, to being more robust and thoughtful about how we're doing our maintenance, basically pumping that number up in recognition of the fact that there's a lot more infrastructure out there. But I know I've talked with the council several times about the way that we do our bigger projects right now. I think Mike has used several times talked several times about how, like Lucor Road, as much as 40% of the cost of the Lucor Road reconstruction may be attributable to putting in storm sewer where there wasn't storm sewer out there before. Well, we're paying for all of that through property taxes right now. It's either coming out of local option sales tax funds or it's coming out of property taxes. By rights, when you move to a model where these are full self-supporting business units, they should be paying for part of that. And there's definitely a trade-off there, because you're trading property taxes for utility funds. But when we set up the enterprise fund for the urban forest utility, it was about, for the property taxpayer, there was about a 10% shift, because there are a lot of non-taxable units out there that pay utility funds that, of course, do not pay property taxes. So for those that pay property taxes, there was a net benefit to the bottom line for making that shift. At the time that we did that, it was about 10%. So we went from the old way of doing it was about $2 a month on a property tax bill. We were actually able to knock that back to about $1.80 when we initially set up the urban forest utility by making that switch. I don't know where that number is now, but that would certainly apply towards that shift as well. Because if you think about it, If you have to collect $150,000 to go towards a bond payment out of sanitary sewer, and you're basing it off of a flow-based agreement, then those that are generating the need for that sanitary sewer are paying for a larger piece of it than just a static charge across property where you're collecting $150,000, but it's simply based off of taxable value. So as we work with our bonding agent, we'll continue to refine that option. It may mean that we'll be proposing some utility pieces or some utility fees directly related to that, but just want you to be ready for that. So some of our other expectations for this budget, we do have an arborist tech position published in there, or proposed in there. That'll continue to build out the urban forest utility. For this year, we are not proposing that we would increase fees in that utility. We would spend down fund balance for supporting that position. I know that might strike some of you as why would we do that, but in this utility fund, that is specifically why we built up that utility balance. We established the fund, and we had some ideas about what it was going to cost to be able to respond to the Emerald Ash Borer when it finally got here, and then we delayed hiring until we'd actually discovered the Emerald Ash Borer in our community. So with that, we know that we need to ramp up what our activity level is to be able to respond to that and do more in-house. So we would propose that we would fund that out of the fund balance. We can't do that for more than maybe 2 fiscal years before we start to get down below where we should be on having a couple months worth of operating revenues in there. So you would see in the future a fee increase related to that, but we would vet that out and run it through the city council. And as we look at the CIP and some of these, we're trying to make sure that we aren't going to come in and say we need to raise every single one of these by $2 a month all at the same time. We'll try to phase them in to be mindful of the impact to the ratepayers. At this point, is everybody ready for a break? I know my voice is. Before we launch into capital?
Yeah.
Would seem like a natural spot to take one.